Hello everybody, and welcome to, this is actually the last speaker keynote talk for the Raumwelten VR Hub Festival this year. So thank you all for coming. I'm really pleased to introduce you all to Durk van der Meer. Oh, disappeared? Or no, he'll come back. I think it's just rebooting. But just to give you an overview, Durk van der Meer, he's a freelance digital artist from the Netherlands. He's actually living in the Caribbean. So that's really cool. When we're talking to him, you can hear actually the birds and exotic creatures in the background. But he builds spaces, a lot of spaces in VR. And this includes level and character design. He does concept art and virtual architecture. And I actually came across Durk's work a couple years back when someone who was also working in this incredible, having incredible aesthetic actually pointed me at his Moringa, which is this beautiful multiplayer world which is just colorful, and it just encourages people just to get lost and explore and play. And it was kind of like a digital pleasure garden of some sort, even a little bit like a theme park. It just makes you want to go deeper, and it gets you curious, and you want to go with somebody else and just kind of lose yourself in the space. So I was always really fascinated by his work, simply because in the end, these spaces are low poly-ish, but the way he creates these spaces and how he frames the spaces really leaves room for people to be able to explore, awaken their curiosity. You know, his color palettes, the way he uses light, the way he uses forms and textures is incredibly interesting. And I'm super happy to have him here also as the final speaker, because with this presentation, he actually created a space for us specifically for this context to talk about his work, to talk about his process. And one thing he's going to be sharing with you all is his approach to how he makes these kinds of spaces, because it's not about copying reality, so to say, and it's not about making it a facsimile, because if we did that, spaces would kind of suck in the virtual realms. But he has figured out this beautiful balance between the real and the unreal, embracing virtuality, and at the same time having enough materials and forms that kind of inform people about what the use of that space could be, or leave space so people at least feel that they can intuitively engage with it in some way. So without further ado, I want to introduce you all to Durk. Yes.
Hold on. We have some rules. So
yes.
He will first give a short presentation here in this space. If you have any question, then please use the react button on the bottom. There you can raise and lower the hand, and then Durk can choose whenever he can wants to give you. You can ask you questions, or we are also can give you the voice, and then you can also react with the other emojis. And please stay here at the moment, but afterwards, after his presentation, we will all move together to his 3D space in the back. All right, Durk, the stage is yours.
Yes, well, thank you so much. As I am quickly doing a reboot of my Chrome, because of course this is the moment that it stops working. Give me a quick second here. Yes.
Yeah, we see it.
So, yeah. My name is Durk van der Meer, and as Alison already mentioned, I've been a digital artist for a little over 10 years, designing virtual spaces, but also assets for games and things like that. I'm going to do a little presentation kind of showing you some work, a little bit of the workflow, and then I want to talk a little bit about how you can translate some elements into the metaverse and hopefully inspire some of you about building stuff for the metaverse. So first of all, as Alison already mentioned, I live in Curaçao, a small island just off the coast of Venezuela. Maybe not everybody knows it, but you probably know its neighboring island, which is Aruba. This is actually the resort that I live on. Has a nice little beach, pretty good internet, although every now and then it does drop out. So I'm just saying that it might happen during this talk. Let's hope it doesn't. Yeah, some nice beaches. I need to, show you some of these tropical pictures. Obviously, also to kind of give you an idea of how it did inspire and inform my style partly. This is actually the Handelsgade, kind of the main downtown Curaçao, where there's these stores that are kind of modeled after Amsterdam houses, old Amsterdam houses, but then the color palette is very Caribbean. So you see a lot of these houses in the Caribbean actually have a lot, are very, very colorful. This is an example of how even like the most oldest, most decrepit houses still get a nice, vibrant color palette. So you see that everything here is painted. You have a lot of murals also in Curaçao. Even the ads, a lot of times they don't have billboards because for a lot of local entrepreneurs they're too expensive, and they will actually just paint the ads as murals on the walls. So there's a lot of art here in Curaçao, and it did inform my style to a certain degree. Although I was working on it before I started living here, it was almost like it was a self-fulfilling prophecy that I would end up on a tropical island. This is a screenshot from Maranga. That's the virtual world that I've been building for about 3 years as a personal project. It's kind of a big, lush, tropical environment of 1 square kilometers that you can walk through. It's available for free on itch.io. The only thing that's broken right now, unfortunately, is the multiplayer, which I intend to fix as soon as possible, but I just haven't had the time to do that. And then hopefully we can get back and do some tours. But I'll talk a little bit about that later on. Another screenshot from Maranga here. So I'm going to show you some of those virtual worlds to start off. And as you can see, I have a strong love for tropical pleasure gardens, as Allison calls them. This is a world, it's called Shelter in Place. It's very small, and you can find it in VR chat. I made this when COVID just hit, and we were all told to shelter in place. That's where it got its name. When COVID hit, everything kind of got put on hold, and even the projects that I was working on, everything just everybody pushed the pause button. And I thought, let me just take this time to make a personal project and see how far I can push the visual quality on a platform like VR chat. They have a Unity SDK, so this was all built and lit in Unity. Here's another shot. It's kind of a small space with kind of a Bedouin tent and kind of otherworldly alien plant life. It actually got nominated for the Raindance Immersive Festival, where it got an honorable mention, which was nice. This is another world that I've been building on VR chat. It's called Suikertuin. It's actually a Curaçao word. This one's a little bit more abstract, trying to push the shapes, but still making it a landscape, still giving the illusion of foliage, but using a geometry and a color palette that's much more painterly, at least in my perception. There's another shot from that same world. This one is called Terrarium, and this is a terrarium, basically. It hangs as a art piece on the wall in the Museum of Other Realities, which is a museum in VR, which I can highly recommend. It's free for download. The cool thing about this terrarium is that it's about 1 meter in width, but as you teleport into it, you scale down. So as you're standing outside of it, you're a giant, and you can see little people walking inside of it. Then you teleport into it, and you become the scale of this terrarium. There are 3 floors you can walk in, and it's a really it was really cool because when the opening of this art piece happened, there were about 12, 14 attendees. I was a little late to the party, to my own party, So when I arrived, I saw my art piece and I saw like 10, 12 miniature people walking around it, commenting on what they saw, with me as a giant standing outside looking in, hearing people respond to my art piece. This is one of those VR memories that that will always stay with me. So I invite you also to check out the Museum of Other Realities, where you can find this piece, but also many other great pieces made for virtual reality. This is another piece I made, also a kind of a tropical garden, more in a nightlife setting. This was for the Cannes Film Festival. They also had an immersive branch where they would show immersive content, VR content, hosted in that same museum. For this, I again went the tropical route because that is also kind of the visual language of the Cannes Film Festival, but I wanted to do it more in a kind of magic hour, dusk scene. This is kind of like, I would say, the evening translation of my tropical style. This is a little bit more of a close-up shot. We'll talk a little bit more about this piece later in the presentation. I'm just going to go through some work right now. Another World actually also hosted in that same museum. They ended up doing a lot of virtual festivals because their infrastructure was kind of set up nicely for that. They have good multiplayer and good visual quality. This was for the Vancouver Film Festival, where I also created kind of a garden with sort of a hut in the middle. You could see in the garden around it previews of the movies they would be showing. Then if you would go into the center of it, you would have these little screens all around. You could teleport into one of those, and then you would go into basically a virtual 360 movie that you could then watch. This was also a really cool job to do. Here, this is also a little world on VR chat. Late 2020, I got involved in NFT projects. One of the companies I worked with was Epic, not that Epic, but the Epic with a K, company doing digital collectibles for a long time. And they wanted me to imagine what an NFT store could look like in the metaverse. So I suggested to them VR chat because I was used to it. You can work in Unity, at that point my game engine of choice, create your whole scene, and just export to VR chat. So this is a little store I built. Unfortunately, just as I was building it, VR chat was internally struggling with NFTs. They didn't really, to my knowledge, to my understanding, really understand the technology of it, and had a kind of a bad taste in their mouth when they heard NFTs, which understandably a lot of people have. There was no way of me to convince them that actually this could be a positive thing for them. So they decided they were not going to be involved in NFTs, and this space, you can still visit it, but it's not one of the public worlds. You can, if you go in VR chat and you turn on community labs, you can see the experimental worlds, then you will be able to find this. All right, going off again with another NFT project. We see here a little small contained garden in my kind of usual style. The cool thing about this one, that this one is actually an NFT, and I made it for a project where we do 3D sculptures. So people would collect these 3D sculptures, and if they collect enough, they would get this one for free. And the cool thing is that this is not just an NFT, it's actually a space that you could open up, then you could put your 3D sculptures inside, and you can kind of explore. So this was kind of an exploration how a space, kind of a museum space in itself, could also be an NFT. This one, yet another garden. I guess you're catching the drift of the thing that I really like to do the most. This is for the Aku project, where I'm the art director, where we are now building out an immersive environment inside of the Unreal Engine, where the first alpha just went public a couple of weeks ago, where I've also created a small garden as for the first stage, planning on creating bigger and more immersive worlds as we roll out. So that's really a first preview of some of my work that I wanted to share with you, and I want to go into workflow just a little bit and show you what it's like. Did I hear somebody ask a question? No. All right. I'll just keep going. All right. So my software, the software that I really fell in love with even a couple of years ago is Gravity Sketch. It's a VR modeling tool which allows you to do low poly modeling. I hear Sketchbox isn't hearing anything. Can the rest hear me?
Yeah, if you don't hear anything, then I just thought that you have to refresh the browser, but we all hear you.
All right, great. So yeah, this is Gravity Sketch, which, as I said, allows you to do low poly modeling, which is great. There's a lot of other VR modeling software tools, but a lot of them use 3D voxels, if that means anything to you. And that really gives you geometry that is then not really easy to put back into VR. And since I really believe in creating in VR for VR, because you just immediately get the feel how it will look in VR, it just doesn't make sense for me to make something on a flat screen and then the purpose of it is it being in an immersive VR space. This is really why I love Gravity Sketch so much, and yes, they don't pay me, but I am a true fanboy of this software. Another great thing about VR modeling is that you have no distractions. So you put on your headset and you can't see your phone, you can't see your iPad, you can't see the internet. You really, for me, I really get into flow state very quickly. One of the things that I did very early on, as I would always do even before working on a flat screen, is of course import images as a reference, which you can do very easily in Gravity Sketch. But I also found that sometimes I don't want to do that. So sometimes I purposely don't use any reference materials, and actually being totally cut off in VR sparks my imagination, and things just kind of happen as I am modeling. This is kind of more of an explorative way of designing things, where you do not have a specific end goal, but you just kind of start. And the cool thing about Gravity Sketch is that the 3D modeling you do inside of it already feels like sketching a little bit. So for these models, I don't do a 2D sketch. No, I start in 3D right away. Maybe I will try 3 or 4 different things before I settle on the design, but this is really the blank canvas where I start, and then I immediately start in 3D, and I feel it just gives me a very different approach to 3D modeling, especially when the ultimate application is VR. So talking about that low poly modeling, and Alison already talked a little bit in her intro about it. Obviously for VR, because you want to have good performance, it is important to have lightweight 3D models. You don't want to have a high poly count. You also don't want to have a bunch of textures. That makes it all very, very heavy and will reduce your frame rate, which is something, especially in VR, that you don't want. I think I've kind of created a style, which I'm not the only one to have done that, where I'm really leaning into the low poly modeling. So this is, for example, a screenshot straight from Gravity Sketch, where I created an art piece for a different project, really leaning into the low poly modeling that Gravity Sketch can do. And because you are placing every vertex basically by hand, and then if you're copying an object and you're scaling it up and down, you're doing it by hand, you're rotating it, all not by typing in or not by, it's all it feels very handmade, because there's a lot of imperfections that seep into your model, and I really like that. I really like the handmade aspect of models. Somehow I especially like it in VR. Maybe that's just my personal preference, but I do feel that it feels more, even if your designs are kind of otherworldly, it feels very human. It feels very man-made, whimsical, as some people has described my style. and wonky is another word you could ascribe to it. But this is really kind of one of the styles that I really like to do. This is another example where I needed to do some foliage for a certain project, and foliage is very known for being very heavy, because if you want to do all the branches and leaves as geometry, it just becomes very heavy very quickly. So I convinced the artist whose work I was translating into VR that we should actually go the low poly route and actually start building his references from a low poly standpoint, which ended up being something that he really liked, and he understood that leaning into this style would have more benefits. I see Raoul asking the VR drawing with tilt brush, which I want to address quickly. I actually love tilt brush, but it's not very easy to then use those the assets you make with tilt brush and reapply them in VR, especially if you want to do UV mapping or you want to do light baking. You need 3D models that have, as you say, good edge flow, which means they have to be kind of predictable in a sense. And tilt brush, I've never really been able to really get that going with tilt brush. So one of the reasons that I really love Gravity Sketch so much. One of the other features, I'm going to go into some Gravity Sketch features because I think that can be really useful. One of the features they also have is you can add an external camera. So as you were modeling inside of VR, you can add an extra camera, and that's the camera that's being cast to your monitor. This is an example where we did something for the community. We did a live stream on Discord. This was also for the ACO project. And then people would give out suggestions, and I would model them in real time. And as I was in VR, I could just move around the model, scale up and down, rotate around it. The viewer would just see this fixed camera standpoint, which, first of all, it's much easier on the eye, and it's much nicer. Even afterwards, you want to turn this into a time lapse, you want to speed it up, it's much nicer. You have a standstill camera. I've started using that extra camera also for some other stuff, where this is another screenshot straight from Gravity Sketch, where I use that extra camera to actually make a composition. Whoops, I think I need to refresh. Can everybody still hear me?
Yes, everything
Hear you.
works so good.
Blank screen here, but I'll just continue. So yeah, I use that extra camera to really frame the composition, because as you're working in 3D, you can constantly change the camera viewpoint, and sometimes you get a little lost when your intention is to make a 2D art piece. So here I use that extra camera for the composition, and then ultimately turned that into this piece that was actually done fairly quickly. I think the whole thing was about 2 or 3 hours, where I rendered it out in V-Ray, did some overpaint in Procreate. Another example of that is this one, where I made a scene, put in that extra camera, so I didn't make a whole bunch of stuff that you wouldn't end up seeing anyway. And the other cool thing about this is you have a real-time light you put in Gravity Sketch, so as you're building out your composition, you can also already kind of test out the lighting. This one was also for the ACO project, and it ended up being this image, then adding ACO, rendering it in V-Ray, then all the stuff you see on the left, on all the artwork that's hanging on the wall. None of that actually is textured. This is just all paint over in Procreate. So this was a nice little workflow that I kind of discovered. Initial setup in Gravity Sketch, do the modeling there, create the composition there with that external camera, quick render in V-Ray, and then very basic render, use that in Procreate, and then do the paint over and put in the detail. Another important feature of Gravity Sketch is the collab feature. The collab feature means that you can actually be in VR with multiple people. And here you can actually see me working with the, what was it called, the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, where their students had made spaces in VR. And I was going in with 10 of those students and actually examining their work. I was just working from home in Curaçao. You can see me in the top right corner, my webcam. And the students would one by one get on stage and explore their space with me. Yeah, the collab feature is really powerful because you can immediately touch and work on each other's geometry. You can also see each other's user interface. So if there are some tips and tricks you want to share, it's very easy to do that. I think this feature is going to be something that will be implemented in much more VR software because it is super powerful, even if not everybody is a modeler. Also, if some people are just art directing, it can be very helpful to actually be in the 3D space and be able to move around a 3D object or move into to a scene like that. This other screenshot is of an interview I did with Gravity Sketch. Can everybody still hear me? Because my screen is got blank.
You're good.
All right,
It's
I'm just checking. Cool.
Blindly going through.
Great. So this is actually an interview I did with the people from Gravity Sketch, where the interviewer and I were in the same 3D space. And as I was doing an example modeling, and here I'm modeling a little piece by Ian McHugh, one of my favorite artists, turning that into 3D. The interviewer was with me there in the space, asking me questions about my workflow and could immediately with me dive into some of the little things that I was doing. We were able to share some tips and tricks. And this was a really cool way of actually kind of having a talk while you're actually using the tool in real time. I've always dreamt of like doing a podcast this way. That always seemed really cool to me, but of course I don't have time to do that. I think one of the other features that I wanted to mention about the collab actually is, let me go back really quickly, is the fact that they've now added a flat screen ability, which means that even if you don't have a VR headset, you could actually join me in a 3D scene just from your browser. And the cool thing is you could actually still set up cameras or view cameras that I've made and then annotate them, just put some text in. And I'm looking into using this for a project, an animation project we're doing right now, because I think it'd be really cool to be able to work with a director in setting up shots and basically doing a storyboard, but in 3D, in VR actually. There's one of these things that I've only recently learned from one of the producers that I work with on the Ako project. His name is Spiros Tsunis. He worked with LucasArts in the past, so he's got a ton of experience, and I'm learning a lot from him. One of the things that he told me is that there are basically two different ways to set up a storyboard. You could do a storyboard, draw it out in 2D, then remake every shot in 3D. The other option, which was much more appealing to me, is called stage play. So let's say there's a big science fiction space scene. You can just build the space as you think it would be. Where's the planet? Where are the ships? Where is the main character? And don't worry about the shots. Don't worry about the cameras. And once you've done that set up that whole stage, actually then you go into the scene with your cameras. You find the shots. You experiment with what kind of lenses you want. You experiment a little bit with the movement of the cameras, but it's much more explorative. And it's much more a way that's much more creative. You also will have much more chance of a happy accident, discovering things that you didn't think was possible. For actually the 3D movie of Jon Favreau, I think, who did the 3D Lion King movie, he also used VR in his setup really just for that. So you could actually be a cameraman in that virtual space and just find the shots the same way you would if you were an actual cameraman. So you're less restricted by the 2D notions of first drawing the storyboard, then recreating them in 3D. So I think this is a very interesting way that VR can amplify design. One of those examples I came across myself a couple of years ago when I was trying to make basically a mountain path. So I wanted to create this path through some mountains. And what I was doing was basically creating both. So in my mind, I was creating those mountains and already thinking about where the path should go and what would make it interesting. But it led nowhere. It was boring. It wasn't fun to do. So I threw it away and I decided to do it differently. I kind of chose that stage play route, although I didn't know the term at the time. I first started to create the mountains and just work on it until I thought, this looks good. This is an interesting natural shape. It really looks the way a mountain should. And then I just went into VR, walked around the mountain, and were just looking at it as if I wanted to climb it. So where is actually the natural path? What would be the way that I would climb this mountain if nobody had made a path for me yet? Then I found a pathway, and although it wasn't perfect, there were some blockages, and then I would just go in and chop away some of the mountain at those places where there was like a bottleneck or there was an obstruction. Kind of the same way you would actually naturally create a path to the top of the mountain. Doing this, first of all, it was way more fun. It was, again, much more of an explorative way to design this thing. And I ended up with a path that had all these interesting twists and turns, and you would do these things that were kind of unexpected that I would have never thought of doing, but the mountain's geometry kind of forced me to do that. So I would go to around a corner to the left, then to the right, and then all of a sudden a big opening revealed the top of the mountain in the distance. All of those kind of surprises just kind of started happening. I wanted to mention this because I think this is a good example of how explorative design can also be fun, but can also make you very aware of how actually restricted you are in your mind when you try to plan it out all in advance. I think another good example of that is we're seeing now is actually the use of AI. Of course, the Raumwelten kind of theme is also around AI. I've been playing around with AI for a while now, and although I haven't really found a good way to use it in my 3D designs, there was one interesting application that I wanted to share with you, which is actually color palette. So I was making, as just a personal sketch, the interior of a subway cart, and I wanted to just have some interesting colors there, nothing more. So I just went into Midjourney, and here on the right you'll see the Midjourney results for the prompt that was a super colorful interior of a subway cart, which then inspired me to do the color palettes of my renders you see on the left. I made actually two versions, and sometimes it's just the prompt is there also just to prompt you creatively, to kind of get you going, have a starting point. I think that's where AI can be really strong. Obviously, I recognize there are some copyright issues with AI, and I do think there's some legal stuff we need to sort through when it comes to the fact that this whole database was created on artists putting their work online. But for now, I'm very interested in seeing how I can use AI in a kind of that explorative fashion. So this is just some of the workflow that I wanted to show you. I want to go into a little bit about some metaverse stuff. So basically, translating things and objects from the real world into the metaverse, just because through building these worlds, I got some ideas on those. So I think we've all seen images like these, virtual symposium, a virtual talk, where literally the real world thing gets built in VR, which to me always feels a bit lacking in terms of creativity. I don't really like these kind of spaces in the real world, so why would I like them in the virtual world? Now, there are some benefits to these worlds. There are some reasons why you would do it. One of the reasons is you know what it is. If you walk in the same way that we're doing a 2D presentation here, it does help people to understand what the thing is we're doing. If you have a stage and somebody is on the stage, we all instinctively know that that's the person that's going to be speaking, and everybody else is basically going to listen. And when it's over, you know, maybe you clap, or maybe you do the VR equivalent of clapping, which, you know, could be jazz hands. Although I think the clapping technology is coming soon. I've seen some examples of that. So yeah, it can be helpful. This is another example of a collab room where you could do brainstorming. But this is not a particularly inspiring environment for me. This is really just kind of copying the real world, but it doesn't really set my brain on fire creatively, so to speak. I think this is the worst example that I saw. People actually trying to read 2D documents inside of VR. At that point, I think, you know, if you want to read an Excel sheet, just do it on your 2D desktop. That technology works way better for that. When it comes to doing brainstorming in a space like this, wouldn't you much rather go on like a walk and talk through, well, let's take Maranga here, the environment that I made as an example. Just to kind of walk through a lush environment to talk about, you know, whatever creative thing it is you're trying to develop. The cool thing about Maranga is, well, actually before the multiplayer broke, which again I need to fix soon, Maranga was nominated for the Raindance Immersive Festival. And to promote that, I did some tours. So I did about 2 or 3 weeks where every couple of days I invite 10 to 15 people to go on a tour with me through Maranga. And some of my best VR memories are of those times where I was basically just the, how do you say, the travel guide. I even had a little umbrella that I made specifically for Maranga so they could, you know, all follow me. And we would walk for sometimes more than an hour through this environment. First great thing was I could see their immediate reaction to the art piece. They could ask direct questions about some of the stuff they were seeing. But the greatest part was actually just the conversations that started happening, not between me and the guests, but between the guests individually. Some guests would actually just wander off and find some place that would speak to them. And later in hindsight, talking to some of the visitors, they agreed that the stuff they were talking about was really building on this space. So they were creatively inspired to you know, talk about what the things they would want to make, you know, and then thinking about like how things actually in Maranga could improve or change. So it really sparked a lot of creativity. And obviously I think Steve Jobs was known for this, that he didn't like meetings, but he would go on walk and talks. He would actually go walk with people and then talk about things. The ever-changing environment having something to do with that state of flow, sparking ideas or having some of those out-of-the-box thinking moments, which seem to be working better if you're in an environment. I think that could be an interesting application of VR. Now, some of the things that we see in VR might not always be super useful. So let's, for example, pick something like a roof. You know, why would you need a roof in VR? There's no rain, there's no wind. But for this piece, the shelter in place piece, I did purposefully create a little tent, a little roof, because I do think that there's a lot of caveman instinct still instilled of us, where we do like to feel a certain sense of safety. We like to be covered. And if you go into the space and there are already visitors, you can see that 90% of them will be sitting in this tent, looking out. So kind of they're back to the wall with a roof above them, with their eyes on the open environment. I think this is a natural setting that kind of makes us feel safe, keeps our eye on what the new thing is, the thing that could be coming, but having some sense of safety behind us and above us. There's a reason, this small tangent, there's a reason where most people, when they describe paradise, they describe something where they're sitting on a beach, looking at the sea, and there are high trees in the foreground. There's one biologist who actually described this as the archetypal painting, because it actually was his idea, spoke to the internal monkey in our brain, where the sea is there within reach, which has an eternal source of food, but the high trees are close, so if there was danger, if there was a tiger, we could immediately climb into those high trees. Now, I don't know how scientifically accurate that is, but I definitely like the thought process behind it, and I do like to think about things like that when creating stuff for the metaverse. So here we have another object that prospect and refuge. I see somebody mentioning. Yeah, exactly. That's a good call out. So here we see a chair, another object that might not be very useful in VR. I know some people like to sit in VR, like go sit on a chair in VR chat. When I go in VR, I'm already sitting. If I'm walking around, I am basically just floating. This is why I don't like to see legs beneath me interpolated, because when I'm sitting, the legs just look awkward. But I do use chairs in my environments, and why do I use them? Because they are actually very good scale objects. The worlds that I create oftentimes are otherworldly. Here, for example, is an example of that small VR chat world where you see huge mushrooms, you see trees that don't give you a direct, exact sense of scale. And then putting a chair there could immediately give you a sense of how big a human would be, and then you would extrapolate how big those objects are. Another function of a chair could obviously be the fact that you see that this is a social space. This is where people gather. Here's an example from the design I did for the Cannes Film Festival, where I actually populated the world with these black figures, kind of unlit figures standing around. So these are not avatars, these are just static objects. Again, to give you a sense of scale in a world where nothing else really gives you a sense of scale because it's all kind of alien. And in this case, it also gives you a little bit of the sense that there's a crowd. There's a social aspect to that. I purposely made them black and unlit, so not to fall into the uncanny valley and not to distract you and make you think that these would be NPCs you could interact with, and really make it clear they are part of the design of the space. Another example of something from the real world that people really love in the real world, a campfire or a light source in general. I got asked by a company called Absurd Joy a couple of years ago to make a space that was cozy. That was basically the only direction that I got. And when I think cozy, I immediately think some kind of campfire or fire indoors. But because the style needed to be very low poly and they were initially building it for the Quest, I didn't want to go the route of creating a realistic fire, because I knew it would fall short of an actual fire, and I don't want to go 60%. I'd much rather go in a completely different direction, but still keep the initial function of the fire. So I started thinking about what is a campfire. Well, a campfire basically is obviously a light, which always has the function of drawing people in, like a moth to a flame. But it also has another function where it's very chaotic. And it's actually kind of counterintuitive how something that chaotic could be so soothing to look at. I think it has something to do with the fact that if it becomes so chaotic, your mind kind of surrenders and stops trying to look at every flame individually. There's something that particles, even waterfalls have in common with that. So in my design, I just made a simple particle system that was just made out of little spheres, but that had that same kind of chaos. The sound, I can't play it right now, but was also not literally the sound of a crackling fireplace, but it was a sound that was close to it. So it was kind of a stylized version of that. So you would recognize it and connect it to the visuals, but it wouldn't distract you in the sense that it didn't feel realistic, because it's not realistic, it's stylized. Still maintaining the function, but not trying to be the real world object. Another example of, obviously this is not my own work, but because I think it is an important thing to mention about translating things from the real world into the virtual world, is that you don't have to show everything. This is where the team behind Half-Life Alyx, which, by the way, I think still is one of the greatest VR games of all times, realized that they could just show the hands and just not show the arms, because the arms would, since there's no arm tracking, the arms would just be interpolated, and then sometimes would just look wrong, because you cannot get that interpolation 100% right. And if you cannot get it 100% right, maybe it's better just to leave it out. Turns out our brains are much better at accepting that something's not there than when something is off and wrong, because then it becomes a negative distraction. So that's basically the last thing that I wanted to kind of show about those translating things from the real world into the metaverse. As I mentioned, this is another shot from Maranga. I hope to be able to, hopefully beginning next year, get in there and fix the multiplayer, so I can get back into giving some tours for people. Please do, says Christoph. Yeah, I really want to. It's been on my list for forever, but I was really busy. I also became a dad. It's no excuse, but again, you'll pay Deutsche coins. Well, let's see. Let's talk about that in the future. Some shots from Maranga. And as I mentioned, you can, if you have a VR headset, you have an Oculus tethered, then you can already download it for free on itch.io and explore it. But I do think some of these VR worlds are best explored together. One cool little feature that I really like to mention and give a shout out to Daniel Beauchamp, who helped me with some of the programming for the Maranga, who is actually the head of AR and VR over at Shopify. He's really good at what he does, and he liked Maranga so much that he was willing to help me for free. He didn't want me to give him any payment, so I ended up building a statue for him in Maranga, which you can find there with a nice little plaque. Fun little detail. One of the things that he realized was I have a kind of stylized cloud system in Maranga, where the clouds are moving and they're casting huge shadows on the landscape, because that's just a visual that I really like. But because I was using a particle system from Unity, he discovered that when you go into multiplayer, everybody's seeing that particle system in a different way, because the random seed that starts the particle system is different every time. And he thought this experience was so important to collectively experience, that you would experience that same big shadow coming over you with multiple people. He found a way to actually make that work for multiplayer in kind of ingenious way, where he attached that starting seed of the particle system actually to the system time on your computer, which if your computer is hooked up to internet and automatically adjusts time, then creates the same seed for everybody. Anyway, that's a little nerdy, little bit of information that I wanted to share with you. So yeah, I'm hoping to get that world up and running. You can follow me on Twitter or LinkedIn and find me through Durk at Work, which is my handle, and I'll do some updates on when it's available for exploration there. This is a shot of the big main house that you can find in Maranga. And hopefully some of you will be interested in doing some tours and we can actually explore this space together in VR. So that's kind of the end of my presentation, and I wanted to keep some room for us to now maybe do some questions or explore the space that I've built that's just around the corner here.
Yes. Thank you so much, Dirk. And let's follow you to your space that you created.
All right, I'm going to quickly refresh because my browser froze, so I'll be back in a sec.
Okay, and then we can follow Dirk.
We can start to progress to the main area over here, his space.
Okay, follow Alison then. Please follow Alison towards the space.
Hey, yeah, hi, nice. My browser froze, so I wasn't able to see how many people attended, but it's nice to see a fairly big group here. Yeah, this is one of those things where I think again, just very basic design of putting some light at the center of the space, and you can already see this is instinctively drawing all of us to the center of it, the same way like a campfire would do. This is also a space that I've made. I think the entire thing was made about in a day, modeled in Gravity Sketch. Then I did some light baking in VR because I wasn't completely sure how to do a different kind of light baking for Mozilla Hubs specifically. I didn't have that much experience with it. But I do think that if you work with Spoke, which is the editor for Mozilla Hubs, you can do a lot of things that are pretty close to the quality you could get in a game engine like Unity. So this is fairly simple, a little bit low res, just to make sure that the world runs smooth. Yeah. So if there's anybody has any questions about this space or how I made this, feel free to ask me or just explore.
Yes, question round open.
Yeah,
No questions so far.
I have a question. Where's Dirk?
Yeah, I'm here.
Oh, here. I have a question. What drives you to make these stuff? You told about starting and COVID and just building, but I assume you get also people who ask you to build for them, or how does this start for you?
Well, for me, it really started just making my own work. I started out in architectural visualization, so very different. And of course, there everything has to be very clean and very straight, and you follow the design of the architect pretty exactly. And I think the style that I've kind of developed here is kind of a reaction to that style, where here it's much more expressive. As I said, no style, no line is perfectly straight. And I started to realize that the work that's in my portfolio is the work that's going to create my future jobs. And if I continue to put work on my portfolio that that's not necessarily work I want to do, then that's going to continue. So I started just making stuff in my spare time, and replaced 80% of my portfolio just with my personal work, which was a bit scary at first because people knew me for the architectural stuff. But yeah, especially when I got on Twitter and I started sharing things there, my work got noticed, and people realized that I could actually make things very optimized for VR, especially those early days, but still have some character and have some style. So I think that kind of leaning into the thing that I love to do the most really paid off for me in that sense.
No, great. But then you can see this maybe as a future architecture, wave architecture. Maybe we at 100 years we only need internal space to live in and to be in these worlds. Or is that too much?
Well, I think it's a good question, but I don't think that a lot of people talk about the metaverse as if it is going to replace the real world. But I think that as a lot of these technologies, a lot of people think about it very binary, like, this new technology is going to disrupt everything and it's going to make the old obsolete. But I think the truth is that the landscape just widens. So this metaverse technology is going to be an added layer on top of the real world. I think people will still want to go to, at least I will, swim in the real ocean and go to the real forest. But the cool thing about the metaverse is that we get to experiment pretty cheaply with spaces in such a way that we can do things where we don't have to take gravity into account. We don't have to take into account that gold is very expensive because in the metaverse it costs nothing, things like that. And then I do think that at some point that design will bleed over into the real world. The way that these new tools and this new way of designing gives us so much freedom. I do think that it's going to give the established world of architecture a little kick in the butt, so to speak, and see that we've been very restrictive in how we think about design, and there's a lot of more like playfulness and craziness that we can inject. And I have to say that there are some buildings in the Netherlands where you do see some architecture already incorporating that, like the kind of building that old people like, but children like as well. That's the kind of style that I like, where it's just universally an experience. And I think the metaverse and designing for the metaverse, although it's going to be slow because that established world does have its preferences. And I know a lot of people that went to architectural school where their teachers were actually against 3D or even against doing 3D renderings, not accepting that the world is changing. Then these tools could actually be a huge benefit in reimagining how also our real future could look like. So yeah, long answer, but the interplay between the real world and the metaverse and how those things will bleed back, I think that's where it gets really interesting. But it takes time for people to get used to that and start incorporating those ideas.
Thank you. Clear.
Yes, later. Any other questions? Okay.
Yeah, I have a question.
Yeah.
Dirk, in the
Side
beginning
for
you
talk.
said that, in the beginning you said.
Go ahead,
Christoph?
Hassan. Go ahead.
In the beginning you said that you are directly sketching in 3D, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so what I thought about when you said it, it's like this: when you sketch it in 3D, your brain can imagine it in real time as it looks in reality. And before, when you made like 3D modeling on a computer, and then if you make it on the computer in 2D and don't see it in VR, you first have to imagine how it looks. But if you don't even have to imagine how it looks, if you can see it in real time, it's a whole different process, I guess.
Exactly. No, that's a very good point. I mean, we don't even realize that so much of the architecture that we see around us actually is based actually 2D. A lot of facades are 2D drawings, a lot of floor plans are 2D, and then they just kind of, these walls get erected, and then we've kind of accepted that this is what 3D buildings look like. But just look at nature and see how much more interesting spatial design could be. And again, if you're sketching in 3D right away, your vantage point is not fixed. You know, you could, as you are drawing a line, you could move around it, and that's seems like a small thing, but I think it's actually a major difference. I think like 100 years from now, we're going to look at a lot of buildings we have now and look at them as basically kind of a combination of 2D planes almost.
Yeah.
And obviously there is a reason why you want to build it like that if your materials are not super strong, and if you want to be like, you know, creating a cube is probably still the most optimized way of using materials and creating the maximum amount of space. But I think the utility of architecture is, you know, and I think hopefully this kind of design could add to us understanding that it's not just about optimizing the maximum space. It's not just about optimizing for amount of sunlight, but it's also, a space can do so much other things. You know, I've talked about this with Alison quite a bit, how the Western world really fell in love with minimalism, first as a style, but then because it just was very cheap to make. Holland is filled with these super boring apartment buildings that they call minimalist, but are just a very cheap way of building, and you don't get happy in those places of the city, especially when those buildings have been there for 40, 50 years, which is usually the time they already get destroyed. They don't enhance your life. I had the pleasure of going to Riga, which was a Jugendstil street in, I think it was Estland, in close to Russia, was a whole street filled with Jugendstil buildings, and every building was a sculpture. Every door was filled with intricate designs and paneling and beauty. And I really think that, first of all, those buildings will still be here in 300 years from now. They will be restored, but they're just part of the heritage, cultural heritage. So they're as green as you could get. But they also enhance just your life as you're walking through a street like that. And I think we need to get back to a place where it's not just about Art Nouveau opens your heart, says Stella. Well, I completely agree. And I think that we need to get back to a place where architecture is not just there to provide a roof and insulation from the cold, but just to be infused by art and you know, inspire people to create their own art. I feel very strongly that we have kind of lost that in a lot of parts of the Western world.
Yeah, I mean, you can in South America, you can see much more colors and details everywhere in arts, but also in architecture. I think it's more colorful there, but also in animation movies, for example, there are also many creative people from South America, and it's also about all these details, I guess, like the opposite of minimalism.
Exactly, yeah, and I see it a lot of, as I mentioned in the beginning, in Curaçao, where people are not afraid of colors. People are not afraid to use, like, if there's a staircase in Curaçao at some place, and at some point somebody decided to just paint it in all these crazy colors. Nobody asked this person to do it, but once it was there, now nobody wants to let go of it, and now every couple of years they repaint it. So I think we have a strong need for that, and definitely if you look at South America and other parts of the world, you can just see that being expressed. There was this, I don't remember where it was, but there was this experiment that this artist did with some favelas. I think it was Rio de Janeiro, where they were painting them in all these bright colors. and it was kind of an experiment, but people loved it so much they kept repainting it, and it also drew in a lot of tourists, and then actually it uplifted those people partly in an economic sense because more money was coming in. So your building should be everything should just be infused with art much more, and I think capitalism has driven us away from that a little bit too much.
I think that you mentioned there as well, like this kind of the process of how you work in terms of, you're in VR sculpting and building the spaces. And so you are actually experiencing in real time, you're seeing those spaces, and people who end up making these incredibly creative, colorful explorations. I mean, they're living in those spaces too. It is their own space, their own home or community. And sometimes there is a huge disconnect between someone who's designing something across the world or far away, and they don't get to see or feel how that space actually makes people perceive the area until it's like much later on in the process.
Absolutely, and I think if you were a child, imagine you're a child growing up in an environment like that. I cannot imagine it not having a huge impact in your development, in your creative development, or whatever other job you are going to do. I think that the way your surroundings look has a big impact, and I think in a way, for me, growing up in Holland and the northern part, where there was not much exciting things going on in terms of architecture, even though the landscape was very flat, everything is really artificial, even the nature is kind of artificial. I do feel like the style that I've explored later on is almost like a reaction to that, kind of going the opposite way and kind of going crazy with color and shape. So you could say, in a sense, that was a good thing for me, but I really hope that like my daughter grows up seeing much more examples of experimentation in all kinds of forms and shapes.
That's an incredible comment. Does anyone else have any last questions? No? Well, I want everyone to give Durk a round of applause because thank you so much. This is Henry's written a lovely comment. Henry, do you actually want to speak it up out loud? Because I think there's something you're trying to say here, about the old Bauhaus idea. Or no, sorry. Okay. This gently listens to reform. Well, it is true about this form follows function. There is a need for that because they have this kind of universality. But this question of this like the international style and cookie cutter kind of thing that could be applied anywhere, not taking into context the area is something to consider. And with VR and these kinds of spaces, these spaces are not really meant for a functional purpose in terms of atmosphere or protecting us from the elements outside. They're really meant to be spaces to feel and to be and to perceive. So I think especially in this context, having spaces and processes that allow for this kind of feeling is probably much more successful than what Durk was showing before of these spaces that are just trying to recreate reality. And I hope that you all also try to see how we tried to do that as well this year at the festival, not sticking with traditional formats. And even the first environment that you come into to help, break away from the traditional forms, except still using some language, of course, that we know, like you'll see our arena upstairs. But I just want to thank everybody so much for coming and for Durk for giving his wonderful talk and this beautiful space that he's created for us. And I also want to mention that if anyone has any other questions or comments, I will be back in the main area up in the arena. You can go up there if you want to continue the discussion. Durk, you're welcome to join as well. And I just want to say thank you all so much. It's been an absolute pleasure. And thank you, Durk, in particular, because this has been, it's an incredible space, and I could not agree more with your work and your process. So thank you.
Thanks for having me. I had a lot of fun. I have to hop off now, but you can find me online. So if there's any additional questions you want to ask me, reach out through Twitter, or you can find my email on my website. So Durk at Work, and you'll find all my contacts. Thanks so much.